Good day. Today is Friday, 12th December 2025, and before proceeding with this video, let me again remind you, if once you've watched the video or whichever part of the video you want to watch, you liked what you've heard, please remember to tick the like button. Well, the big news over the last 24 hours was the confirmation from General Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, that the Russian military has captured the fortified town of Seversk. Now, he did this in a report that he gave to Putin. It was, in fact, a conference, a virtual conference. It was not clear where Gerasimov was talking from, and other senior military officials also participated virtually in this conference. But this time there was no attempt to deny or pretend or hide the fact that Putin himself was in Moscow. He participated in the conference from his office in the Kremlin, and which was, by the way, Stalin's old office, just saying. And, well, this time, as I said, what I strongly suspect was the fiction that he had visited, that Putin had visited, the headquarters of the Russian groups of forces on the front lines. Well, that was not preserved. It was put aside. I think that the last occasion when this, as I said, fiction was pushed during the last meeting, televised meeting that Putin had with the military. It was so obvious that the entire meeting was taking place in a set that this time it was decided that it might just as well, it would work just as well to make it obvious that Putin is in Moscow and working from his office, working from within the Kremlin. Incidentally, to those like myself who are devotees of films and who have seen old Soviet films set in the Second World War, it's rather interesting to see Putin in his office, which was, as I said once, Stalin's office, having meetings with top military officials, including the chief of the General Staff, and receiving reports from the chief of the General Staff, just as Stalin did in that same office during the Second World War, as is shown in those old Soviet films. Anyway, I am not going to push the parallels, and let's go instead to the very important news that Gerasimov and the other military officials provided. And of course, the centerpiece of that news was the capture of the town of Siversk. Now, Seves is a relatively small place. I believe it's between 10 and 15. It had a population of between 10 and 15,000 people before the start of the war in 2022, though I'm not absolutely, I can't say I remember exactly. But anyway, Siversk is a relatively small place, but it is apparently on an elevation, on higher ground. It therefore basically dominates the surrounding landscape, and this is often the case with important fortified positions that the Ukrainians, with their Western friends, the United States, the US military has admitted that US Army engineers played a significant role in helping Ukraine devise its defense lines, build up its defense lines in Donbass. I remember that this was actually said by a US military engineering officer right in the early months of the war, when it seemed briefly as if Ukraine was holding its own. Anyway, just to say, Siversk was strongly built up and developed by the Ukrainians as a key linchpin of their defences in northern Donbass. And very like the town of Ugleda in the south, in southern Donbass, which fulfilled a very similar role for the Ukrainians in southern Donbass. Siversk was very much a bone in the Russian throat. The Russians made numerous attempts to capture Ugleda in the south and suffered losses and were repulsed on several occasions. And they made similar attempts to capture Seves in the north. And again, these attacks were regularly repulsed, and once again the Russians suffered losses. The point about Seves is that, as I said, it was not exactly on a hill, but on higher ground. It dominated the surrounding landscape, and it was also connected to various roads and railway lines, which made it relatively straightforward to supply from the big town nearby, which is of course Slavyansk. Now, here I should say that the importance of Siversk to the overall Ukrainian defense system was well understood. And I remember that briefly in the summer of 2022, reports appeared all across the Russian internet that the Russian army had entered Siversk and had captured the town. And in fact, these reports were so widely circulated and were repeated by so many seemingly reliable sources that at the time I believed those reports to be true. And I said in a program on this channel that Siversk had indeed fallen. This, to repeat again, was in the early summer of 2022. Well, obviously, that was completely wrong. In fact, there was a Russian attack on Siversk at that particular time. A Russian armored column tried to move towards Siversk across the Seversky Donets River, and it advanced from a sort of forested area in this territory, and whilst it was fording the river, it was shelled by the Ukrainian artillery, which was located in Siversk. The Ukrainians had obviously been provided by the US, the United States, with intelligence about the presence of this armored column, and the Russians did suffer significant losses over the course of that operation and were obliged to pull back. That incident, by the way, which was significantly inflated in terms of its scale, was widely commented upon and discussed in the Western media at that time, as I very well remember. Anyway, so Siversk has stood and has been held by the Ukrainians ever since. And without being able to capture Siversk, it was impossible for the Russians to press home attacks on the important town, the key town of Slavyansk, and their entire defense system, all of their positions in northern Donbass and southern Kharkiv region, their positions in places like Izium and Kupiansk and Balakleya and Liman, all of which they controlled in the summer of 2022 for a short time. Anyway, all of their positions in these places were unstable. And eventually, the Ukrainians counterattacked in this very same area, and the Russians were obliged to withdraw. And this was perhaps Ukraine's biggest success over the course of the war. And it was made possible because of Ukraine's successful defense at that time of Siversk. Now, the Russians made several attempts afterwards to move towards Siversk. They found it extremely difficult going, and eventually, those attempts were put on hold, and for many, many months during the period of the special military operation, Siversk and the Ukrainian garrison there were left alone. But this year, the Russians came back. They came back in much greater force. Their armies were far better organized this time. Importantly, over the course of 2023, the towns of Bakhmut and Soledar to the south of Siversk, which in 2022 had provided most of the supply lines to Siversk, the Ukrainians had lost them. The Russians captured those two towns in 2023. And over the course of 2025, when the Russians returned, they were able to conduct a very complex operation, which has now resulted in the fall of Seves. And the capture of Seves will, I have no doubt, lead fairly quickly to the capture by the Russians of Liman, or rather the recapture of Liman, the next important town to the west, bigger than Siversk, a town that the Russians briefly held in 2022, and it will lead also to the capture of various other positions closer to Slavyansk, between Siversk and Slavyansk, essential for the defense of Slavyansk. Places like Raya Alexandrovka that I've mentioned in recent programs, and the important town of Ragnarok, which the Russians were unable to capture in 2022 because they did not capture Siversk. And I would add that I expect very soon, with Kupiansk under Russian control, with Liman soon to be under Russian control, with other places somewhat to the north, also likely to fall under Russian control shortly, the Ukrainians still hold a bridgehead east of the Oskol River, in the southern straits of the Oskol River, but the Russians seem to be intent now to push the Ukrainians out of it. Anyway, once all of this territory is under Russian control, which I suspect will take no more than a few weeks, then the Russians will be able to advance to the other towns in southern Kharkiv region, Izium and Balakleya, which they also controlled in the summer of 2022. And at that point, the encirclement of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation can properly begin, something which the Russians were unable to achieve in 2022. So the fall of Seversk is extremely important. In fact, its importance cannot be overstated. The entire linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in northern Donbass has now collapsed, just as was the case last year, in October last year, when Ugledar fell to the Russians in southern Donbass, and the entire defense system that the Ukrainians had in southern Donbass, including the important town of Kurakovo and other places, Velikaya Novosilka. All of these places also fell rapidly, one after another, after the fall of Ugledar. We're going to see something, though I suspect on an even bigger scale, now play out in northern Donbass. So the fall of Siversk is very important news. It may not be a big place. It might not be a place which in the normal order of things, the civilian order of things, the peacetime order of things, is that important. It is not a major industrial or economic center. It is not an important population center. It is not a place of great cultural or historic significance. In fact, descriptions I've heard of it speak of a bleak, run-down industrial town, and that was how it was before the war. But in terms of strategy, in terms of the battle that has been playing out in Donbass, its importance is indeed very great, and at this point, perhaps even crucial. Anyway, with that lead up, let us now go to what happened at this meeting yesterday, the meeting that took place in which Putin spoke to the Russian military chiefs from his office in the Kremlin. And by the way, you can see the Russian, the Kremlin has provided film of at least part of this meeting, though no doubt that part of the meeting which was filmed was staged, at least in part, for the cameras. Anyway, let's now go to the meeting itself, to the transcript of the meeting that the Kremlin has provided us. And I'm going to focus entirely on what General Gerasimov said to Putin. He said that in the area of the responsibility of Group of Forces North, main efforts are concentrated on increasing the depth of the security zone in the border areas of Ukraine's Sumy and Kharkiv region. And then I'm not going to discuss this in any detail, but he says, he appears to suggest that the Sumy offensive that the Russians appeared to be conducting earlier this summer, but which was then put on hold, that the Sumy offensive is now being reactivated, and it seems as if this is indeed the case. But as I said, that is a topic for discussion on another day. And then Gerasimov had this further to say. Following the liberation of Kupiansk. Now, notice that Gerasimov here is talking about the liberation of Kupiansk. He is, in a sense, he's in effect telling us that Kupiansk continues to be entirely under Russian control. We've had endless numbers of claims over the last week or so about successful Ukrainian counterattacks in the Kupiansk area and of Western Kupiansk having been brought back under Ukrainian control. And of course, Zelensky himself has spoken about a great victory that the Ukrainian army supposedly achieved in Kupiansk. Gerasimov, with these few words, is basically contradicting all of that. And I have no doubt that he is right. I've discussed this in many programs recently. I am confident that all of Kupiansk is and remains under Russian control. Russian commentators have spoken about small groups of Ukrainian raiding parties trying to enter Kupiansk to establish a presence or re-establish a presence there, and of all of these raiding parties being rounded up by the Russians and destroyed almost as soon as they arrive. Occasionally, some of these people have been able to produce films or have been filmed by nearby Ukrainian drones, and this has given an impression sometimes of a Ukrainian presence in Kupiansk, but there has never been enough sustained video footage from Kupiansk to confirm that the Ukrainians really do control any part of the town. The videos have been brief and short and unconvincing in that regard. Anyway, for what it's worth, I think it's worth a great deal, but for what it's worth, Gerasimov treats the fact of Kupiansk being under Russian control as an established fact. Following the liberation of Kupiansk, units of Group of Forces West continue offensive operations to eliminate encircled enemy units east of the city on the left bank of the Oskol River, in other words, in the area of the Cauldron. While tightening the encirclement, assault units have liberated the villages of Kucherovka and Kurilovka. Kucherovka was taken, I believe, 2 days ago, according to the Russians. Kurilovka, the Russians confirmed that they had captured it yesterday. And if you look at the positions, if you go to a map and look at the positions of these two villages, you will see that they now provide a clear semicircle around a belt of territory east of the Oskol River, which is where the trapped Ukrainian troops presumably, in fact, must be. Anyway, so the cauldron, the noose, if you like, around the Ukrainian troops east of the Oskol River, according to Gerasimov, is tightening, and I have no doubt that this is true. And then Gerasimov continues, meanwhile, active operations continue along the Liman and Rubtsi axes to seize the major railway junction and logistics hub of Liman, as well as the villages of Drobyshevo and Yarovaya. And what he's referring to here is various military operations that have been conducted around Liman, west of Siversk. Drobyshevo is the last important village that the Ukrainians still control, close to Liman itself. It's almost an outlying suburb of Liman. There is undoubtedly fighting. In fact, there's been video footage which confirms this. Fighting at some level, at least, going on inside Liman itself. Now that Siversk has fallen, I have no doubt that the fighting in Liman will intensify. And then Gerasimov says this: assault units of Group of Forces South are fighting their way into Constantinfka. 45% of the built-up area of the town is now under our control. Now that is much more than any of the mapping projects have so far acknowledged. The mapping projects do now all show fighting inside Constantinfka itself, but I think it is fair to say that they basically show around 10% of the town under Russian control. Gerasimov says it is closer to 45%. At the last televised meeting with the generals, which took place earlier this month, I think it was on the 1st of December, the commander of Group of Forces South said that he expected Constantinfka, the greater part of Constantinfka, to be under Russian control by mid-December. And Putin said, slow down, don't be in too much of a hurry. There's no timetable or deadline for this. But if this report is correct, if what Gerasimov is saying here is true, then the Russians are indeed on track to take control of more than half of Constantinfka by the middle of this month. So there it is. It's interesting information, and it strongly suggests that the defenses of Constantinfka are crumbling even faster than the defenses of Pokrovsk crumbled when the Russians began their operation against Pokrovsk in the late summer. And perhaps that is not surprising, because Constantinfka is on low ground and the Russians control all the high ground around it, both to the west and even more so to the east, after their capture of the town of Chasiv Yar. So the Russians can basically see where the Ukrainians are in Constantinfka. They can do it with drones, but they can do it also from ground observations because they're on the high ground. And of course their artillery and their other forces located on the high ground are in a good position to attack any Ukrainian troops that they observe inside Constantinfka itself. I suspect that there are also now increasing problems for the Ukrainian garrison in Constantinfka of supply. The Russians are now close enough to all of the various supply roads to Constantinfka. And when I say supply roads, there are only a few. In fact, there's only principally one, and that comes from the north, from Kramatorsk. The Russians are sufficiently close to that supply road to be able to interrupt and traffic, to destroy traffic on that road using their first-person view drones, their FPV drones. And I suspect that this is already taking place. And as I said, this is making the Ukrainian defense of Constantinfka much more difficult than it might otherwise have been. And the Russians have spoken of, in the past, of how the Ukrainians drew forces away from the defense of Constantinfka, firstly to defend Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, and then when the Russians achieved their breakthrough northeast of Pokrovsk in August, with the Russian capture of places like Zaloty Kolodyar, Kucherov Yar, and all of these other places, Siversk conducted counterattacks to regain control of this territory. And in order to do that, he had to take troops away from the defense of Constantinfka. And this has made it easier for the Russians to advance there. Now, if this is all true, if this is correct, and of course, to repeat again, I am not there, and this information that Gerasimov gives us goes beyond what has been so far provided by the various mapping projects. But if this is all true, it is likely that the fall of Constantinfka is also weeks away, no more than a few weeks away. So the Russians control Pokrovsk, they will soon control Mirnograd, they control Chasiv Yar, and it looks as if they're going to control Constantinfka itself before long. Once Constantinfka falls, that leaves only Slavyansk and Kramatorsk as major towns still under Ukrainian control in Donbass. And, well, at that point, we are definitely looking at an encirclement of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And I'm going to make a suggestion here that if this information that Gerasimov is giving us about the situation in Constantinfka is true, then the final encirclement of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, establishing what will be by far the biggest cauldron of the war so far, could very well take shape before the end of the winter. Just saying. So anyway, the news about Constantinfka is in its own way almost as important, perhaps as important, as Gerasimov's confirmation of the fall of Siversk. And in fact, Gerasimov, straight after talking about Constantinfka, had this to say about Seves. The city of Seves has been liberated. The center group of, and then he went on, having just announced blandly this extraordinary fact about Seves having passed under Russian control. He then talked about the situation in Pokrovsk. And he said the center group of forces is engaged in the destruction of encircled enemy formations east of Pokrovsk. Of course, he doesn't say Pokrovsk, he says Krasnoarmeysk, just to repeat again, but I'm going to stick with Pokrovsk, which is now fully under our control. Now, there continues to be all kinds of stories all over the internet, in the West and on the Ukrainian side, that the Ukrainians are still resisting in Pokrovsk. Siversk has said this. If Siversk says it, it must be true. The Ukrainians have recently published pictures of Ukrainian troops showing the Ukrainian flag in a building in north central Pokrovsk. Many have treated this as proof that the Ukrainians are indeed in Pokrovsk. I strongly suspect that that video was made before Pokrovsk fell several weeks ago, and that it is in fact an old video made for precisely this purpose. There is no doubt that Pokrovsk is under Russian control. Everybody who has been watching and tracking the battle in Pokrovsk closely can see this. The amount of disinformation, and I say this, or rather propaganda, if you can prefer, about the state of the battle in Pakrovsk is extraordinary. Bild Zeitung, which is a German newspaper, managed to speak to Ukrainian troops on the ground in Mirnograd, and they confirmed the fall of Pakrovsk. But the media in the West mostly continues to take what Siversk, who has never been an especially reliable source, they take what he says as true. Now, I have to say, I find this extraordinary. I can understand why the Ukrainians are not willing to acknowledge the loss of Pakrovsk, despite the clear evidence that Pakrovsk has indeed been lost. But I struggle to understand why media outlets in the West simply take their cue from Zelensky and Siversk on a question like this. Now, the Western media, in acting in this way, in consistently preferring Ukrainian accounts of the state of the battle to the observable facts about the state of the battle, to my mind, they're acting not as objective observers of the battle, but as news outlets that are directly involved in the war. You would expect the Ukrainians to say things like this about the Battle of Pakrovsk if Western countries were directly involved in a war with Russia. If they were at war with Russia, they would perhaps also be reporting the state of the battle in Pakrovsk in that way. But in the West, we continuously insist that we are not yet at war with Russia. Well, our media, in the way it reports the war, acts as if we were. Just saying. And the coverage of the situation in Pakrovsk, which, by the way, has now extended, unsurprisingly, to the way in which certain AI sites are reporting the situation in Pakrovsk. Anyway, the way in which the state of the battle of Pakrovsk is being reported, as I said, all but establishes that in the minds of some people in the West, we are in effect in a kind of war with Russia. Anyway, to continue with what Gerasimov said, units of the Second Army have liberated the village of Rivne, with combat operations ongoing in the area of Svetloye, and in the Russian Defense Ministry repeatedly says that the Russians are now in the process of mopping up Ukrainian resistance in Svetloye. Svetloye is a very small settlement, from what I can see, located immediately to the east of Rivne. Rivne and Svetloye are two villages that basically link up Pakrovsk with Mirnograd. They provide a basically uninterrupted belt of human settlement which connect Pakrovsk with Mirnograd and make Pakrovsk and Mirnograd essentially a single conurbation. Just saying. So anyway, that's what Gerasimov is telling us about that battle. And then Gerasimov continues, the entire southern part of Mirnograd has been cleared, with fighting continuing in the city centre and in the north and northeastern parts of the city. So the fighting now is confined to northern Mirnograd. And again, I've noticed that the mapping projects have adjusted their maps and that it's only a small circle of territory in Mirnograd which continues to be under Ukrainian control. And that is now widely acknowledged. Furthermore, units of Group of Forces Center are making successful advances in Dnipropetrovsk region, engaged in battles to liberate the village of Novopavlovka. Now, about a week ago, or maybe a bit longer, Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which has people on the ground, said that the Ukrainians had largely withdrawn from Novopavlovka and that they were still in control of only about a fifth of the village, and that the Russians were close to gaining control of Novopavlovka, despite the fact that Novopavlovka had been assumed to be a very heavily fortified place. Well, what I would say about that is that was about, as I said, 2 weeks ago. We've heard nothing from the Novopavlovka area since. Maybe the Ukrainians introduced more troops into Novopavlovka. Maybe they counterattacked. Who knows? Somehow or other, in one way or the other, assuming that original report from Redovka was true, the Russians were slowed down or even pushed back in Novopavlovka. But now Gerasimov is telling us that the Russians are engaged in battles to liberate Novopavlovka, which strongly suggests that that village also, important fortified village, more like a small town, is about to fall. And then there is the next, and perhaps equally important section of Gerasimov's report. Troops of Group of Forces East have crossed the Gaichur River in several sections, are developing an offensive in the south of Dnipropetrovsk region and the eastern part of Zaporozhye region. Street fighting continues in the effort to capture Gulia Polier. Now, we've had a lot more news over the course of this morning about the situation in Gulia Polier, and this is not yet confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry, so it should be treated with caution. But the reports say that the Russians have indeed crossed the Gaichur River in several places, and that Ukrainian defences in the central part of Gulia Polier have collapsed. Gulia Polier, it appears, is about to fall. Now, again, I'm not on the ground. I am not able to say whether these reports are true, but the people who are reporting these things tend, in my experience, to be reliable sources. So, if Gulia Polier has or does fall and falls within the next couple of days or weeks, and Gulia Polier is not a big place. It is about the same size as Siversk, just saying. Well, if that happens, the way is open for the Russians, as I've said in many programs, to move westwards and to encircle Orechov, the last remaining important town under Ukrainian control in Zaporozhye region, except for the great city of Zaporozhye itself, which is located on the Dnieper River. And as to that, Gerasimov had this to say. Troops of Group of Forces Dnieper in the Zaporozhye sector have liberated the village of Novodanilovka. I have already discussed this in previous programs. Novodanilovka is located to the south of Orechov. And the other village of Malaya Tokmachka, which the Russians also claimed some days ago, about a week ago, to have captured, though this has been disputed. I believe it to be true, by the way. Anyway, that lies to the southeast of Orechov. And Gerasimov then continues, combat operations are continuing to seize Primorskoye and to destroy enemy forces encircled in Stepnogorsk. Now, that contradicts, in fact, it refutes claims that all of Stepnogorsk is under Russian control. There have been many reports to this effect, but it turns out that they are wrong. There are still some Ukrainian troops holding out in central Stepnogorsk, 20 kilometers south of Zaporozhye city, but according to Gerasimov, they are encircled. Now, here I'm going to make a further quick observation. The Russian advance from the east towards Zaporozhye city has acquired a seemingly unstoppable quality. It's like a giant locomotive that moving from east to west, smashing through every obstacle in its path. And if Gulia Polier is indeed about to fall, and if it is indeed captured, then Zaporozhye city is indeed very much on the horizon. There is a constant narrative that Russian advances have been slow and small and incremental. The Russian advance towards Zaporozhye city, towards the Dnieper from the east, began in December 2023, in my opinion, following the fall of the town of Marinka, a fortified town close to Donetsk. Then the Russians were held up for about 4 months, trying to capture another heavily fortified village called Novomykhailovka, which they eventually captured in April 2024. Since the capture of Novomykhailovka, however, the pace has gradually but steadily quickened. So after Novomykhailovka, Ugleda fell, then Kurakovo fell soon after, then Velikaya Novosilka. And the Russians then paused in this area, but then they resumed their offensive in midsummer of this year. And over the course of the last few months, they've advanced westwards from Velikaya Novosilka all the way to Gulia Polier, and Gulia Polier is about to fall. If you take the starting point as Ugleda, the Russians have now covered around 2/3 of the territory they need to cover by my map estimations, which might not be foolproof, admittedly. They've covered around 2/3 of the ground until they reach the city of Zaporozhye itself. And this is the harder ground. This is the place where there were the more heavily fortified towns and villages, where the trench lines and the fortifications had been prepared and dug, places closer to Donbass, to the key fighting in Donbass that has taken place since 2014. If Gulia Polier falls, there are fewer communities, fewer towns and villages. It's mostly open steppe land, and there are fewer defences. So, again, to say it simply, I would not be surprised if we saw Orekhov encircled within a few weeks, and if Orekhov itself were to fall perhaps by the early spring, and at that point, very soon after, the Russians would be close to Zaporozhye and close to the river. Now, I've gone through all of this in some detail today because this is a disaster. This is a military crisis which is existentially dangerous for Ukraine. The Russians, meanwhile, continue to hammer Ukraine every night with drones and missiles. And again, one of the officials in Kiev responsible for energy supply to Kiev has made further statements today. He says that Kiev might again soon face long stretches without electric power. He said that there are indeed 2 nuclear power stations which are supplying electric power to Kiev, but the Russians have damaged one of the transformer stations. It is impossible, therefore, to supply electric power from one of the nuclear power stations. Perhaps the supply of electric power from another nuclear power station might also become very, very difficult. The entire situation with electricity supply to Kiev now hangs in the balance. So, Kiev potentially could find itself without electric power very soon. There is, as I said already, an economic collapse underway across Ukraine. There are reports that the Ukrainian army, there is confirmation across Ukraine that the Ukrainian army is in an extremely poor state, that many military units are now desperately short of men. There are a few elite units that continue to be equipped and equipped to high standards, and which also have mostly their full complement of troops, but they're mostly connected with the nationalist brigades. They are difficult by the Ukrainian command itself to control. They sometimes refuse to participate in battles in various places. And besides, they are not many of them. So this is a profound crisis. And this drumbeat of claims that all is well in Ukraine, that the situation in Ukraine is still stable, that the front lines are not going to collapse anytime soon, that the situation in Donbass is still relatively stable, that Russian advances are incremental, that Pokrovsk has not fallen, that if Pokrovsk does fall, it is not going to make a major difference to the battle. Well, all of these things are creating in the West, even I suspect on some of the people who repeat these things, who repeat these claims, but may know deep down that they are either not true or barely true. They're fostering a dangerous climate of complacency, a belief that there is still a huge amount of time, months and weeks, to spend ironing out various proposals, and that these proposals can then be presented to the Russians, and the Russians can be leaned upon to accept these proposals. And of course, all of this is now backed by further assumptions that the Russians themselves are in a bad position, that they've suffered enormous losses, that they're losing huge numbers of men, and that for that reason, there is now a good possibility, a strong possibility, that the Russians can be persuaded in some way to agree to a compromise in the war that falls well short of their objectives. And the diplomatic strategy that many people in the West are advocating, I'm afraid, seems to me to be the product of that complacency. Now, I'm going to address quickly here this vexed subject of Russian losses. I've already said that I believe I know the level of Ukrainian losses up to the 1st of August 2024. And even if it is not as high as some claims on the Russian side suggest, it is still appallingly high. Now, we on the Duran were recently very privileged to interview an actual war correspondent from the West who has done what very, very few people in the West, very few journalists in the West actually do. Patrick Lancaster is an exception. He's actually gone to Donbass and he's actually toured the battlefields and he's met with the military people there. He's spoken to Russian soldiers, he's spoken to Russian officers, and he's tried to get an actual sense of the mood and the situation on the battlefields. Now, this program is not yet published, and for that reason, I'm not going to say too much about it. It should be published fairly soon, and I would urge everybody who is watching this program to go and watch it. As I said, it's coming out very soon on the Duran, perhaps tomorrow. Anyway, all I will say about it is this. This journalist, who is, by the way, from Portugal, went to casualty stations. He met Russian soldiers. He pieced together information. The information is obviously anecdotal. One cannot say that it is absolutely secure, because he's only one individual traveling across an enormous contact line. But the overall impression that he gives about this question of casualties is that not only are the Western and Ukrainian numbers about Russian casualties massively wrong, but as far as I am concerned, they call into question even the much lower numbers provided by Mediazona. I just say this. Now, I make this point because in a discussion I recently had with Daniel Davis on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, Daniel Davis told me, and he told me this openly, you can see it also on his program, he told me that Western governments have been briefed by their intelligence agencies. He has had this from various sources, reliable sources, people who are fully informed about this, that he has been provided with information. The Western governments are being provided with information from their intelligence agencies that the Russians are suffering losses in the region of 1,000 to 1,500 men a day. Now, that is completely inconsistent with what this Portuguese journalist is saying, is reporting from the Russian lines. And frankly, it is not consistent with what I am seeing happen on the battlefronts. So it seems that Western officials, Western governments, drawing their information from this information that they're getting from their intelligence agencies, assume that the Russians are running out of steam, where in fact I believe, and I believe all the information shows, that on the contrary, they are gaining steam. They are moving faster and faster because they are getting stronger, and it is the Ukrainians who are getting weaker. Now, Daniel Davis did say that there is dissension within the intelligence community about these numbers. Some people within the intelligence community communities, plural, believe that Russian losses are significantly below the 1,000 to 1,500 men a day estimate, much lower in fact, though I suspect still too high, just saying. But it seems that Western leaders continue to be briefed by their intelligence agencies on the basis of the higher numbers, and if they are ever given the lower numbers, they choose not to believe them. Now, anybody who knows the record of previous wars, of Vietnam, of Afghanistan, of others, will recognize this pattern. I remember Ray McGovern, who was a CIA analyst in the 1960s during the war in Vietnam, discussing what actually has also been recorded in published histories of the war, that US officials at the time were reporting much higher casualty rates amongst North Vietnamese troops during the Vietnam War in the 1960s than was actually the case. I also remember during the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan that the figures for Soviet losses in Afghanistan that were appearing at that time in the Western media and which seemed to have an origin within Western intelligence communities magnified Soviet losses by an order of 10. And more recently, and again, Daniel Davis said this on the program. You can see, if you go to the program on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, you will see that he actually says this. He actually says that his own experience as a US soldier in Afghanistan was that the intelligence agencies then, I'm talking now about the American intelligence agencies, were providing information to Washington about Afghan losses, Afghan insurgent losses, which were risibly too high. So the same pattern appears to be repeating itself in the conflict in Ukraine. Now, the point is, it is leading the West, in my opinion, into a disaster. And we could see this playing out over the last couple of days, because we are, of course, firmly now in the process of the West once again negotiating with itself and paying absolutely no attention to what the Russians are saying. So we have a situation where, well, this is to some extent based on what Zelensky is telling us, but there are now suggestions that, yes, the Ukrainian army should withdraw from Donbass, but the territory that they withdraw from in Donbass should become a demilitarized zone on South Korean lines, that it be turned into some kind of free economic zone. I have no idea how that would work, and I wonder whether that is an American idea at all, or whether it originates from someone in Europe or from Zelensky. There are apparently now multiple plans again circulating and floating around, and it may be the case that some of these don't have an American provenance, just saying. And Zelensky is saying that he cannot himself agree to any territorial concessions, and that there would have to be a referendum to agree to that. Some people, by the way, I think mistakenly are seeing in this some hint that that Zelensky is prepared to compromise on the territorial issue. He is intending nothing of the sort, as the Russians have just pointed out. he's talking about a referendum on the issue of withdrawal from Donbass. When he talks about this and referendums on issues of territory, Zelensky has been repeatedly agitating and maneuvering to get a ceasefire on the existing conflict lines and an unconditional ceasefire on the existing conflict lines. What he is basically saying now, because he has repeatedly said that a referendum can only take place, a vote in Ukraine can only take place if there is a ceasefire. That a vote can only take place if there is a ceasefire. So that for a referendum to take place, to address the territorial issue, there has to be a ceasefire first. It is simply another play by Zelensky to get another ceasefire, on the existing conflict line, something which the Russians have, of course, always refused. And beyond that, of course, there are the obvious technical problems. If there's going to be a referendum, where is that referendum going to be held? Is it going to be held purely on the territory that the Ukrainian government controls? Or is Zelensky going to argue that it should be conducted right across Ukraine, in Donbass, in Crimea, in Russian-controlled territories, in Zaporozhye and Kherson region as well? Again, this is, as far as I can see, an obvious stall, an attempt to win over Donald Trump to the idea of a ceasefire and a freeze on the existing contact line without really being prepared to make any fundamental compromise. Now, the Russians have spoken about all of these ideas, and including the demilitarized zone, the free trade zone, the free economic zone, the referendum. And importantly and interestingly, the Russians took the decision this time that the person who would comment about all of these things would be none other than Yuri Ushakov, Putin's key foreign affairs advisor, the man who advises Putin on all questions relating to the issue of Ukraine's settlement and agreements and diplomacy with the United States. A man who might even possibly, if there are any substantive negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, the man who might even conceivably be the lead Russian negotiator. Just saying. Anyway, Ushakov has been withering about all of this. He says that there's absolutely no need for a referendum about Donbass and about Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass, because Donbass is Russian. Donbass is Russian, all of it. There is a constitution. That is the Russian constitution, and that is what it says. The words Donbass is Russian, all of it, have been said by Ushakov himself. Those are direct quotes. Then he continued, sooner or later, if not through negotiations, that by military means, this territory of Donbass will come under the full control of Russia. Everything else will depend on this alone. A ceasefire in Donbass can only come after the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops. And what happens after that? Well, in my opinion, it is possible to have a conversation about it, because it is possible that there will be no Russian troops there directly, neither Russian nor, of course, Ukrainian, but there will be the Russian National Guard, the Rosgvardia, there will be our police, the Russian police, there will be everything that is needed to maintain order and to organize life. So, yes, maybe the Russian military might not be placed might not be positioned in eastern Donbass. Look, he's not saying that that's a definite, but certainly Russian administration, Russian security forces will be present in eastern Donbass because this is Russian territory. And then he talked about all of these ideas that have been floating around the media now, demilitarized zones, Korean-type settlements and things of that kind. Of course, at least to include some passages, he talks about the Europeans, that the Europeans are trying to amend the American proposals. Of course, at least to include some passages and proposals unacceptable to us in the documents the Americans are preparing. That is the point to these changes. We have not yet seen these documents, which are currently being compiled, taking into account the comments of Europeans and Ukrainians. It is unlikely that these documents will contain things that are positive. It is possible Zelensky will view the whole process as an opportunity to simply achieve a temporary ceasefire. That is all. Sooner or later, active contacts with the Americans will resume, but what the Americans are currently coordinating with the Europeans, with the Ukrainians, must eventually be shown to us. So Ushakov is already saying that many of these ideas that we see floating around the media today are unacceptable to Moscow. And he's saying it undoubtedly in a way that is intended to be noticed and heeded in Washington itself. The Russians are not interested in ideas of demilitarized zones, free economic zones, the sharing of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, any of these ideas that are currently floating around. Nor are they moved by Zelensky's proposals to hold a referendum on the territorial issue. And I suspect what they're hearing about ideas for peace monitors or peacekeepers to patrol the territories, and also about security guarantees analogous to Article 5 guarantees as would be provided by NATO if Ukraine were to join NATO. The Russians won't like any of that at all and will straightforwardly reject it. So, again, why are these proposals even being put forward? Why are the Americans even considering these proposals? One can understand why Zelensky is. He wants to bring these negotiations to a stop. I have discussed this often. He won't accept, he won't acknowledge the collapse that is gradually playing out on the front lines. The Europeans, perhaps deluded or misled by this bad intelligence that they're getting, also don't want the conflict to end. And besides, as I've discussed in many programs, they have multiple reasons for not wanting it to end on the basis of a negotiated solution, one negotiated by the Americans and the Russians, which might threaten eventually the establishment of some kind of Russian-American condominium over Europe, a spectre that has haunted the European imagination ever since the original détente discussions between the Soviet Union and the United States in the 1960s, and which has now returned with a vengeance. Anyway, but why are the Americans even giving these ideas so much as the time of day? Because I can absolutely guarantee that if the Americans come along with any one of these ideas to the Russians will reject them. And again, the Americans may believe that the Russians might be forthcoming, they might be amenable to negotiating on these proposals. because of the enormous losses, they might believe that the Russians are suffering. But if that entire premise about the Russian losses is wrong, so in that case is the diplomatic strategy. I repeatedly read in article after article, often written in complete good faith, people who clearly want to see peace come forward and say that just as the Ukrainians are going to have to make compromises in order to achieve peace, so must the Russians. But why, if the Russians are winning the war, would they compromise in the way that people suppose? Why would they, as a Russian commentator once put it, why would they surrender, give away the victory that is now in their grasp? Obviously, it is true that Russian soldiers are dying on the battlefields, and with every day that the war continues, more Russian soldiers will die. And obviously, the value of human life is not something one should ever overlook, and Russian lives have value. But of course, in war, the great problem, the tragedy of war, is that it, by definition, devalues human life, and in fact, it creates an alternative political dynamic. Because once a war is fought, once soldiers join up and fight, and some of them die, it becomes essential to demonstrate to the survivors that the price paid was worth paying, and at that point, victory, the demand for total victory, inevitably is going to increase. My assessment is it has been so for a long time, that is the dynamic that is playing out in Russia now. We are past the point where the Russians would have been prepared to make compromises of the kind that they made at the time of the Istanbul Agreement, early on the war. Too many Russian lives have been lost to make those compromises acceptable now. Now, it's not just Gerasimov who has been speaking. The Russian Foreign Ministry has provided a detailed transcript of an extraordinary speech that the Russian Foreign Minister gave to a conference of ambassadors from the Global South who were invited to the Russian Foreign Ministry. And, well, the roundtable discussion, as it is called, it took place yesterday, provided Lavrov with an opportunity to give a systematic account of the whole history of the Ukrainian conflict to the Global South ambassadors. It is the single most clear and structured account that I have seen provided by the Russians up to now. It gives a step-by-step account of everything that went wrong from the time of Ukrainian independence all the way up to the start of the special military operation. It is very interesting and very insightful and contains a great deal of information which I admit I myself, for example, did not know. But anyway, I am not going to go into it. I'm not going to discuss it or read out from it now in any detail because, it is very long. But what I will simply say is this. Lavrov is not giving any ground here. He continues to regard Donbass, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions as Russian territory. He repeatedly talks about the root causes. He talks about the importance of reinstating the position of the Russian language and of the canonical Orthodox Church. He talks about neutrality, returning to the position of neutrality. He is totally unimpressed by Ukrainian claims that they cannot change their constitution to enshrine neutrality in their constitution. He makes the point that neutrality was originally there in their constitution when Ukraine became independent of the Soviet Union, and it became independent on that basis, and it was on that basis that Ukraine was recognized as independent by the Soviet Union, by Moscow, and by other countries. And it is all set out in painstaking detail. I notice that Lavrov, in talking about the rights of Russian speakers and the oppression of Russian speakers, carefully mentioned Nikolaev and Odessa, talking about them in effect as Russian cities. Putin only occasionally does this. Lavrov does this regularly, but this extraordinarily well prepared, exceptionally well prepared summary that Lavrov is giving has clearly been prepared by the Russians over several weeks in light of the negotiations with the Americans that are now underway. And I have little doubt, in fact, I have no doubt at all, that it has been approved by Putin and by the other members of Russia's Security Council. There's been some talk, some comment about Lavrov's mysterious disappearances over the last couple of weeks. I suspect that one of these reasons for these disappearances, which I've discussed in other places, is because Lavrov and his team at the Foreign Ministry were spending an enormous amount of time working on this document. Now, given that that is so, given that the Russians have set out their position in such detail and clarity to the Global South ambassadors, and we are told that most of them were there, apparently something like 97 ambassadors or heads of mission in Moscow participated in this discussion. Anyway, given that the Russians have gone to all this trouble to set this all out in the way that they have done, I have to say that I just don't get the sense that they're in any mood to make any fundamental concessions at all. Some people in Russia, I suspect quite a lot of people in Russia, probably by now already consider the June 2024 Istanbul Plus proposals that Putin made to the Russian Foreign Ministry as compromises which have now been overtaken by events and which go too far. And for example, I strongly suspect, if I have no doubt at all, that there is considerable dissension. I've discussed it in previous programs, and I've pointed out how Putin himself has been challenged over it by sections of the Russian media, that there is clearly dissension in Moscow about the provision that Ukraine be allowed to join the European Union. Anyway, to repeat again, the Russians are winning the war. They are winning the war, and they're winning it rapidly. It is unlikely, if the war continues, that Ukraine will be able to avoid total defeat in 2026. And I'm putting this much more mildly than perhaps is the case. The Russians don't feel that they are under undue economic pressure. The talk that circulates on this topic in the West, I've discussed it many times. The Russians are not under the kind of economic pressure that many people in the West believe they are. And, well, I have to say, based on the commentaries, the comments that Russian leaders like Putin and Lavrov and others, Ushakov, are making, I don't get the sense that that the Russians feel that they're losing men in the war at anything like the level that would oblige them into a premature and unsatisfactory peace. And as to that, I think it is most unfortunate that people are bringing up or publicly talking about the Korean variant. Because, of course, the Korean armistice that was agreed in the early 1950s was intended to be a temporary arrangement pending talks to establish a final peaceful settlement of the conflict in the Korean Peninsula. Instead, that never happened. Those substantive talks never took place, and instead of the conflict being resolved, what has emerged in the Korean Peninsula instead is what looks like a permanently frozen conflict. That is precisely what the Russians have repeatedly said they will never accept and will not agree to. So, talking about the Korean variant, presenting to the Russians with things that appear to be drawn from the Korean variant, like demilitarized zones and such things, will almost certainly provoke Russian opposition and will ensure that these proposals, when they are made, will be basically dead on arrival. Now, I said all of this. Here I want to say something else. This Portuguese journalist that I talked about has taken all of the risks and a great deal of trouble to go to the Russian side of the war, to meet the Russian soldiers and to speak to them, to get a sense of their mood and feelings, to see how well or badly organized the Russian army is, and all of those things. When the video comes out on the Duran, you can judge it for yourself and you can see the conclusions that he comes to. Others doing the same thing as him might perhaps have come to different conclusions. But that brings me to the role the Western media has played in this matter. If this Portuguese journalist could go there, so certainly could journalists from other Western media as well. Obviously, they would have Russian handlers, and they would not be allowed to see everything that they might want to see. But that in itself would provide information of a kind. Instead, these journalists, Western media outlets, have themselves taken the decision to avoid doing that. They have avoided sending their reporters to Donbass, to Zaporozhye, to Kherson region. So how, in light of that, can they be so sure about the state of things on the Russian side? This is a fundamental mistake that is being made if you listen only to one side and close your ears and eyes to what the other side is saying, either about the diplomacy or about the state of the war, then you are almost certainly going to get things badly wrong. This is why, by the way, on these programs, I pay attention to both what Zelensky says and to what the Russians say, and I look at what both sides also say about the state of the battle. Western media outlets, in my opinion, don't do this to anything like the extent that they should do. And by approaching it in that way, they too are fostering in the West a completely mistaken understanding of the state of the battle. Anyway, there it is. I don't believe that there is going to be a peace settlement. Owen Matthews, who's recently become deeply skeptical of Zelensky and has come to understand that Ukraine is in crisis and is losing the war, has written a long piece in The Spectator saying that the end of the war is in sight, that chaotically, blunderingly, Donald Trump and his team are moving towards some kind of peace settlement with the Russians. I have to say that for the moment, I simply don't agree. The original 28 points that Kushner and Witkoff worked on did move the dial significantly towards Russian positions. And the Russians said that they were prepared to sit down and talk about them. But it seems to me that in this convoluted process that we have, in which the Americans talk to the Europeans and the Europeans talk to the Ukrainians and everybody in the West negotiates with everyone else, we are gradually, as Ushakov is now saying, moving further and further away from the points, the ideas in the 28 points, which were most attractive, or at least closest to what the Russians are looking for. And I'm afraid that when the moment comes and the Americans put it all together and Witkoff travels with a new set of proposals to Moscow, assuming of course that he ever does, what he will present to Putin and Ushakov is something that they will say simply will not do. It's straying not just from the 28 points, but from the understandings that Putin and Trump reached in Anchorage. Far from seeing the diplomatic resolution of the conflict coming into sight, I see it slipping further and further away. Anyway, there it is. Now, let me repeat again. There is a formula for ending the war, and it is a formula that Putin outlined back in his speech to the Foreign Ministry in 2024. In my opinion, it should have been accepted then. That would have ended the war then, and tens of thousands of lives would have been saved, and Ukraine would have been preserved. The Russians are starting to shift beyond it, move away from it. And in a few months, they will hold Donbass. And quite plausibly, they will be outside Zaporozhye city and on the Dnieper. At that point, it is a certainty that the Russians will say that June 2024 no longer applies. There have to be more territorial changes, and probably there will have to be a reconstruction of the government in Kiev too. And the demands from Moscow, as by the way the Russians have warned, will at that point increase. And what will we then do? Anyway, this is where we are. I don't know whether there is any mood in Europe or Washington to accept Istanbul Plus. Apparently Witkoff has in the past suggested it, but I doubt that it's going to happen. And the mood of that meeting between Putin and the generals, it seemed to me, was uncompromising. And I got the clear sense that Putin, at least, is still thinking, is very much thinking of continuing with the war and ending it with a military victory. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X, and our new Substack page. Please remember also that to support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel, and well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.